Welcome, fellow seekers of the shadowed truth. You stand at the precipice of the STF Horror Vault, a repository of the real and the unreal, the unsolved and the unholy. Tonight, we delve into the deepest recesses of the wilderness, where the boundaries of the known world dissolve and the ancient darkness holds sway. We are not here for ghost stories or campfire tales. We are here for the chilling, documented accounts of those who encountered the things that should not be. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the silence of the woods, the logic of time, and the true meaning of being alone. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and let the dread seep in. The files are open. The forest is waiting. Jack had been a park ranger in Oregon's Cascade Range for nearly 8 years, a tenure that had etched the contours of the wilderness onto his soul. He was a man of quiet competence, a student of the forest's subtle language. He knew the difference between the wind's sigh and a predator's breath, between a deer's track and a trespasser's boot print. The forest was his sanctuary, a vast, green lung of the world where the rules were simple. Respect the wild, and it will respect you. But on the morning of October 3rd, the forest was speaking in a dialect Jack had never heard, a language of pure, unadulterated dread. The air, usually crisp and invigorating, felt thick and heavy, like breathing in cold, wet ash. The signs were not just wrong. They were an inversion of the natural order. His routine patrol began with the sun barely a promise behind the eastern peaks. The southeastern quadrant was his responsibility, a sprawling 40 square miles of ancient growth, treacherous ravines, and trails so isolated they were little more than deer paths. This was the territory of the truly solitary, the kind of wilderness that demanded respect and offered none in return. Jack cherished its isolation. It filtered out the noise of the world, leaving only the essential. As he rounded the bend near Clearwater Creek, the essential was violently interrupted. The abandoned campsite was a tableau of domesticity rendered obscene. It sat in a small clearing, 30 yards off the main trail, bathed in the sickly, pale light filtering through the canopy. The tent stood perfect, a bright splash of nylon against the somber greens and browns, its stakes driven deep. It looked as if its occupants had simply paused their mourning. But the details were a chorus of wrongness. The oatmeal, congealed and cold now, was the first discordant note. He touched the pot again, a nervous tremor running up his arm. Cooked but uneaten, a sudden, violent interruption. The two hiking boots, side by side, outside the tent flap. They spoke of a calm, deliberate removal, a final act of preparation before sleep. But where were the feet? Jack called out, "Hello, Ranger. Anyone here?" His voice eased to life. The IDs belonged to Madison Morgan and Luke Bell. Jack radioed headquarters, his report clipped and professional, masking the churning fear in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that he was not looking for lost hikers. He was looking for a scene of violence. He began his search, moving away from the campsite, his ranger training taking over the primal urge to flee. 15 feet from the tent, he found the first clue, a fleece jacket crumpled against a fallen log. It was not a casual drop. It was a violent shedding, a desperate attempt to lighten a load. 50 feet further, a baseball cap snagged in the low, thorny brush. Then the water bottle dropped and left, cap still on, water still inside. Each item was a silent scream, a marker on a trail of forced retreat. Someone had been running, or more chillingly, someone had been dragged. Jack followed the trail of terror deeper into the woods, into the ancient, silent heart of the forest. The trees here were colossal, their canopies so thick they created a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. He was moving into a realm where the sun barely penetrated, a place of shadow and deep, undisturbed rot. The undergrowth was a thick, thorny mess of ferns and devil's club, and yet the path of the struggle was clearly visible. crushed vegetation, broken saplings. Then the blood. It was a smear on the bark of a massive Douglas fir, a dark, rusty stain at shoulder height. Not a wound, but a transfer, a sign that a body had been pressed against the tree with force. From there, the trail became a nightmare cartography. Droplets on the moss, a larger, sickening pool on a flat, wet rock. And then, the unmistakable sign of a predator's work. Drag marks in the soft earth near a small, rocky ravine. Two parallel lines, deep and unforgiving, suggesting something heavy, something lifeless, had been pulled across the ground. Jack's hands were slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for his radio, a desperate plea for the cavalry forming on his lips. Static. Flat, dead, mocking static. He tried his cell phone. Nothing. The forest had cut him off. It had created a pocket of absolute isolation, a vacuum where the rules of the civilized world did not apply. The repeater towers, the modern miracles of communication, were useless here. The forest had decided he was alone. The silence was no longer merely oppressive. It was sentient, a vast, malevolent presence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He was a small, fragile thing in a place that had suddenly revealed its true, terrifying nature. He marked his location on his GPS, a desperate anchor to reality, and turned to retreat. He had to get to a place where his radio worked. He had to call for help, but as he turned, a sound, thin and brittle, pierced the silence. A voice, a woman's voice, weak, terrified, and repeating a single, broken word, help. It was a sound that tore through his professional caution, overriding every instinct for self-preservation. He plunged forward, abandoning all protocol, tearing through the undergrowth, following the sound of that desperate, fragile plea. He found her 200 yards past the bloodstain, hidden inside the hollowed-out, rotting trunk of a fallen log. Madison was a wreck of mud, tears, and terror, curled into a fetal ball. Her eyes were wide, vacant, reflecting a horror that Jack could only guess at. When she saw him, she didn't recognize a rescuer. She saw a shadow, a shape, and she screamed, a raw, animal sound that spoke of a soul pushed past its breaking point. It took 20 minutes to calm her, to convince her that his uniform and badge were symbols of safety, not another threat. What she finally told him was a fragmented, nightmarish account that turned his blood to ice. They had been sleeping when the thing woke them. Not a bear, not a sound, but a profound, chilling sense of being watched. Luke had unzipped the tent. He had said something, a question, a challenge, a final word, and then the thud. The sound of bone and flesh meeting something impossibly hard. Luke's choking noise. Madison had scrambled out, just in time to see the figure. Human, yes, she insisted, but wrong. Large, male, dark clothing, but the way it moved, the inhuman strength with which it dragged Luke away by his ankles, pulling him into the pre-dawn gloom. It was a creature of the forest, not a man. She had screamed, she had followed, and then the figure had dropped Luke, turning its dark, featureless face toward her. It hadn't walked, it had lunged. She ran, a blind, panicked flight through the undergrowth, the sound of heavy, relentless pursuit crashing behind her. She ran until her legs failed, then found the log, crawling inside, pulling leaves and debris over herself, praying the earth would swallow her whole. She had spent hours in that hollow tomb, listening to the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, circling the log, stopping, moving on, then returning. They were searching. She had stayed silent, even when Jack called, because the footsteps had sounded too close, too purposeful. "He's dead," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He made a sound, and I saw the blood on his head when the thing was dragging him. Jack knew he had to move. The killer was still out there, possibly still close. He helped Madison up, her ankle twisted and useless. The agonizing, slow walk back to the campsite was a constant, nerve-shredding ordeal. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of terror through them. Jack kept his hand on his sidearm, his eyes scanning the impossible density of the stream back to the ravine, the drag marks now a focal point for a dozen flashlights. They found Luke where Madison had said, concealed beneath a pile of branches. The blunt force trauma was horrific, confirming Madison's worst fears. He had been killed quickly, brutally, missing for 6 weeks. The cadaver dogs, brought in later that day, turned the investigation into a nightmare. Over the next 3 days, they made discoveries that shattered the peace of the Cascades forever. In a 3-mile radius, they found 14 bodies, buried or concealed in shallow graves and under debris. Some were fresh, others were skeletal, representing missing persons cases that had gone cold years ago. The victims, all killed by blunt force trauma or strangulation, several showing signs of having been bound, were a grim testament to a decade-long reign of terror. The killer's pattern was meticulous. Target hikers camping alone or in pairs in the most remote, isolated corners of the forest, places where their screams would be absorbed by the ancient, indifferent trees. This was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated harvest. For Jack, the following weeks were a descent into a personal hell. The forest he loved was now a mass grave. He was haunted by the details, the careful way the killer had concealed the evidence, the cold, logistical planning. He realized the killer wasn't a monster that lived in the woods. He was a monster that used the woods, exploiting its isolation, its silence, its vast indifference to human life. Madison was whisked away into protective custody, the only witness, a fragile link to the predator. The massive manhunt, drones, trail cameras, hundreds of man-hours, yielded nothing. No fingerprints that matched. The killer had vanished back into the silence he commanded. Weeks turned into months, and the case file, thick with 14 names, slowly moved to the cold case division. Jack requested a transfer, unable to breathe the air of a forest he now knew was a crypt. He had seen the truth. The wilderness was not just indifferent, it was an accomplice. He never truly escaped. He still wakes in the dead of night, the smell of pine and damp earth in his nostrils, hearing the thud, the drag, the fragile, terrifying whisper of help from the hollow log. He knows the killer is out there, still hunting, still using the vast, beautiful, and utterly merciless Pacific Northwest as his personal, silent vault. The mystery remains unsolved, a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes the deepest horror is not what you find, but what you realize is still watching you from the shadows. Isla was a woman of science, a wildlife biologist whose world was governed by data, logic, and the observable laws of nature. She had spent 3 years with the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, and her latest assignment was a nocturnal animal study in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The goal was clinical: set up audio recording equipment to track owl populations, monitor hunting patterns, and document territorial calls. The execution, however, required her to spend 5 to 7 days at a time, alone, deep within the forest's most isolated reaches. Isla was comfortable in the wilderness. She was a product of the Pacific Northwest, a seasoned camper, and her graduate studies had taken her into terrain that would make lesser hikers weep. Solitude was not a threat. It was a condition of her work, a necessary silence for listening to the wild. Her research area was in the southern Gifford-Pinchot, a region of old-growth forest, steep ravines, and limited human access. During her initial survey, a park ranger had mentioned, almost apologetically, that local indigenous tribes considered certain sections of the forest spiritually significant and traditionally avoided them. Isla, the scientist, filed it away as interesting folklore, a cultural footnote, that had no bearing on her acoustic protocols. She should have paid attention to the tremor in the ranger's voice. On her third night in the field, settled in her base camp near a small, gurgling creek, Isla began reviewing the audio recordings captured over the previous 48 hours. She sat in the pale glow of her laptop, headphones clamped over her ears, sifting through hours of forest sound compressed by software designed to flag owl vocalizations. The initial playback was exactly as expected. The rustle of wind, the distant rhythmic rush of water, the distinct calls of various owl species. It was the sound of nature's quiet, indifferent machinery. Then, 3 hours into her review, she heard it. She stopped the playback, her hand freezing on the mouse. It was a voice. Not an animal sound that mimicked human speech, but an actual, faint, distant human voice. It seemed to call out a single word. She rewound, isolated the segment, and increased the volume. The word was a name. Her name. Isla. The sound was stretched, distorted, as if the recording equipment had captured it at the wrong speed, or perhaps as if the throat that produced it was not quite human. It was pronounced with 2 syllables, a questioning, searching intonation, echoing through the dark emptiness of the forest. Isla checked the timestamp. 2:47 a.m. She had been asleep in her tent, miles from any established trail, in an area where no other human was supposed to be. She systematically checked the equipment. No radio interference, no audio artifacts. The voice did not sound like a transmission. It sounded like someone standing in the forest, calling out into the night. She rationalized. Sound travels strangely in the humid, cold night air. Maybe a distant camper, calling to someone else who happened to share her uncommon name. She was a scientist. There had to be a logical explanation. The next night, the logic began to crumble. She checked her new batch of recordings. Her name was there again. Multiple instances captured at different times throughout the night. Worse, they were recorded by different devices scattered across her research area. Each voice was subtly different. A low whisper, a high, reedy call, a guttural rasp, as if multiple entities were calling to her from different directions. But all of them were saying her name, in that same stretched, distorted way that made the skin on her neck crawl. There was no rational explanation for multiple, simultaneous recordings of her name in the middle of a supposedly empty forest. The pragmatic scientist in her was forced to concede to the primal human instinct. Something was wrong. This felt less like a scientific anomaly and more like a deliberate, terrifying summons. On the 4th night, the situation escalated from unsettling to frightening. Isla was performing a routine check, replacing batteries in a recording unit half a mile from her camp, when she heard the voice without the mediation of any electronic device. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. Isla, it echoed between the massive, silent trees, the same distorted, questioning intonation. She froze, every sense hyper-alert. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She called out, identifying herself as a researcher. The only response was silence. A silence so profound it felt like a hell breath. Then, 30 seconds later, the voice called again, this time from a different direction, closer. Isla abandoned the equipment. She walked quickly back toward her camp, not quite running, but moving with a desperate, driven pace. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly on the narrow trail. Behind her, the voice followed. Isla, then again, from a slightly different location, always parallel to her path, as if whatever it was pacing her retreat, a silent, unseen escort. She sealed herself inside her tent, feeling the flimsy nylon walls as a pathetic defense. She tried to rationalize a prank, an auditory hallucination, an animal mimic. None of it felt adequate. As she lay in her sleeping bag, trying to force her racing thoughts into a logical sequence, She realized she could still hear the voice, faintly, relentlessly calling her name from somewhere just outside the tent. Then, the equipment began to fail. Her flashlight, with fresh batteries, sputtered and died. Her GPS unit powered off and refused to restart. Her satellite phone showed a full charge but could not establish a connection. Even her simple digital watch began displaying random, meaningless numbers. It was as if an invisible, localized force was actively draining the power from her technology. She replaced the batteries, only to have the devices shut down again within minutes. She sat in the absolute darkness of her tent, too terrified to move, listening to her name being called over and over from various points around her campsite. It was a chorus of dread, a symphony of the unseen. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. She woke to the pale, gray light of dawn. The forest was silent. The oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. Her equipment was functioning normally again. She checked the recordings. Every single device had captured the same thing. Hours of her name being called in multiple, distorted voices, with no context, no other sounds, just the endless, terrifying repetition. But the worst discovery was in the data logs. According to the GPS timestamps, she had lost approximately 2 hours. Her memory of the night was continuous, but the timeline showed a gap from just after midnight until 2:30 a.m. where no recordings existed and no device logs showed any activity. It was as if she, her camp, and all her technology had simply ceased to exist for that period of time. Worse still was the fate of the abandoned recording device. When she returned to the location, a distinctive spot where a fallen log created a natural acoustic chamber, it was gone. The device, its mounting hardware, the camouflage netting, the bright yellow marker tape, every trace was meticulously removed. She expanded her search, her scientific rigor battling her rising panic. That's when she saw the footprints. Her own tracks from her panicked flight were clearly visible in the soft earth. But alongside them was another set of prints. They were not animal tracks. They were not human boot prints. They were human-shaped, but impossibly wrong. Too long, too narrow, with a shape that suggested bare feet rather than shoes. And they paralleled her trail for several hundred yards, a silent, unseen companion, before vanishing completely near a rocky outcropping. Isla ended her field session immediately. She packed only the essentials, abandoning the heavier equipment. The 3-mile hike out was the longest, most terrifying journey of her life. She felt the constant, cold weight of eyes on her back. Shapes flickered in her peripheral vision, vanishing the moment she turned to look. When she finally reached her truck, she locked the doors and sat there, gasping, overwhelmed by the relief of being enclosed in metal and glass, separated from the malevolence of the trees. She filed a report about the missing equipment, omitting the voices and the footprints. She knew no one would believe her, and she wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. The project was suspended. The audio files were analyzed by specialists. They offered only inadequate explanations: electronic interference, psychological episodes, sleepwalking. But one analyst, who studied the phonetic structure of the voices, noted something chilling. The voices, when filtered, appeared to be speaking in a language or dialect that did not match any known indigenous language from the Pacific Northwest. It showed structural similarities to several extinct languages documented by anthropologists in the early 20th century. Later, the ranger who had first warned her contacted Isla privately. He arranged a meeting with an elder from the Cowlitz tribe. The elder listened to Isla's account, nodding slowly, his eyes ancient and knowing. He explained that the area where she had been working was a traditional burial ground, a place where the dead had been laid to rest in a manner that predated European contact by millennia. The land was sacred and forbidden, not because it was evil, but because the spirits there were active and did not welcome the intrusion of the living. The voices, he said, were the ancestors. They were trying to drive her away, to protect the sanctity of their resting place. When Isla asked why they called her name, the elder's eyes fixed on her with a chilling intensity. To speak a person's name, he said, is to create a connection, a spiritual link. They were not calling you to harm you, but to mark you. They wanted to ensure you would never forget what you experienced, and that you would never return. Isla never went back. She left the Department of Fish and Wildlife, abandoned her career, and moved to a city where the noise of traffic and the glare of streetlights could drown out the silence of the forest. But the mark remains. Every time she is alone, every time the wind whispers, she hears it, the faint, distorted, questioning call of her name, a reminder that the ancient darkness of the Pacific Northwest knows exactly who she is, and that a part of her soul remains lost in the 2 hours of time that simply cease to exist. The forest has her name, and the spirits are still waiting for her to answer their call. Isaac and Nora were pilgrims of the wild, their faith rooted in the immutable laws of the wilderness and the precision of modern technology. For 5 years, they had explored the trails of Washington and Oregon, their partnership a finely tuned machine of preparation and awareness. They were not casual weekenders. They were serious backcountry enthusiasts who understood that the line between adventure and disaster was a thin one, guarded by vigilance. Their gear was top of the line, GPS watches tracking every metric: elevation, heart rate, distance, and exact coordinates. They carried paper maps and compasses as sacred, non-electronic backups. They were trained in wilderness first aid, capable of sustaining themselves for days. Their confidence was not arrogance. It was the earned certainty of experience. On September 15th, they set out for what should have been a straightforward day hike in the North Cascades, a familiar 11-mile loop they had completed 3 times before. The trail led to an alpine lake, a place of spectacular, high-altitude beauty. They started at 7:30 a.m., signed a trailhead register, and began the familiar ascent. The first 2 hours were a comforting ritual. They passed the landmarks like old friends. The massive cedars split by lightning, the creek crossing where they always filtered water, the rocky outcropping where they had once seen a black bear. Everything was normal, familiar, and predictable. Then, at approximately mile marker 4, the forest changed. It wasn't a visual change at first. It was an absence. "It's too quiet," Nora murmured, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden vacuum. The usual symphony of the forest, the distant chirping of birds, the buzz of insects, the subtle rush of wind through the high branches, had ceased. There was only an oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to actively absorb sound, muffling their footsteps and swallowing their voices. It was the silence of a tomb, a silence that felt not natural, but enforced. Isaac pulled up his GPS watch, a small, cold knot forming in his stomach. His brow furrowed. According to the device, they were no longer on the trail. The coordinates placed them nearly 3 miles west of their planned route, in an area their paper map identified as dense, unmarked forest with no established trails. Yet, they were standing on a clear, well-worn path, following markers that looked identical to the ones they had been seeing all morning. They stopped and compared their watches. Both devices showed the same impossible location. And then they noticed the time. According to their watches, it was 11:45 a.m. But they had checked the time at the creek crossing less than 20 minutes ago, and it had been 9:30 a.m. "That's impossible," Isaac whispered, the word feeling hollow. Even accounting for the steep terrain, they had not hiked for over 2 hours in what felt like 20 minutes. Isaac, the man of science, tried to rationalize a simultaneous software glitch, a localized magnetic interference. But the unease was a cold tide rising in both of them. This was more than a technical error. It was a discontinuity in reality. They decided to retreat, to retrace their steps to the last point of certainty. But when they turned, the trail behind them was unrecognizable. The split cedar was gone. The creek was nowhere to be found. The path they had just walked seemed to wind through alien terrain, even though they had been on this exact spot moments before. Nora pulled out the compass. The needle spun slowly, erratically, refusing to settle, as if magnetic north had become a suggestion rather than a fixed point. The forest had not just gone silent. It had become fluid, hostile, and actively misleading. They started walking, relying on the angle of the sun and their deep, intuitive knowledge of the terrain. Neither wanted to voice the growing terror. They had been lost before, but this was different. This felt fundamentally wrong. After what felt like an eternity, though their watches now showed only 15 minutes had passed, they emerged from the forest into a clearing that should not have existed. It was a large, perfectly circular space, perhaps 200 feet in diameter. The ground was bare, dark earth, devoid of vegetation except for strange, geometric patterns of dead, yellowed grass, lines and shapes that looked deliberately arranged, like some ancient, forgotten symbol. In the exact center, a cluster of rocks was arranged in a way that defied natural formation. Isaac and Nora stood at the tree line, instinctively unwilling to step into the open space. The air here was colder, the silence deeper. And then they saw it. On their exposed arms and the backs of their hands were small, circular burns, each the size of a quarter. They were raised, red, and looked as if they had been touched by something intensely hot. The marks didn't hurt, but they were undeniably new. Neither of them had any memory of how they had gotten them. Isaac looked at his watch again. The time display now read 2:15 p.m. Hours had passed. He had no conscious memory of them. The last clear moment was emerging into this clearing, which, subjectively, had happened minutes ago. He asked Nora to guess the time. "Noon, maybe 12:30 at the latest," she replied, her voice shaky. When she looked at her own watch and saw 2:15 p.m., her face went white. They stood there, two experienced hikers, stripped of their most fundamental possession, their memory of time. There were no gaps in their awareness, no sensation of unconsciousness, just a sudden, terrifying discontinuity. The sun's position confirmed the watches. Hours had vanished, but where had they gone? Their clothing was torn in places. Their boots were caked in mud inconsistent with the dry trail. Nora noticed a small stain of blood near Isaac's collar. He touched his neck and found a scratch he hadn't felt. Nora had similar scratches on her arms, hidden beneath her jacket. They made the decision to move, to circle the perimeter of the clearing, staying within the relative safety of the tree line. As they moved, Isaac's GPS watch suddenly flickered and began working normally. The coordinates it displayed were a final, terrifying confirmation. They were 15 miles from the trailhead, far beyond the endpoint of their planned route. They had somehow traveled in a direction perpendicular to their intended path, an impossible feat of navigation. The trail they eventually found led them downhill until they intersected with a Forest Service road. There, they encountered two hikers who stared at them with genuine concern. Isaac and Nora must have looked like wraiths, muddy, scratched, and utterly disoriented. The hikers drove them back to the ranger station, a journey that took over an hour by truck. At the station, they filed a report about getting lost, omitting the missing hours, the strange clearing, and the circular burns. They offered a plausible lie. They had become disoriented and taken a wrong turn. The rangers accepted the explanation without question, but privately, Isaac and Nora knew the truth was far more sinister. They were examined at a hospital the next day. The doctor, perplexed by the circular burns, ordered additional tests, including a scan for radiation exposure. The results were chilling. Elevated levels of radiation, not immediately life-threatening, but definitely abnormal and inconsistent with natural environmental exposure. The case was noted. Somehow, The information reached researchers who had been quietly documenting unusual incidents in the North Cascades. Isaac and Nora learned they were not alone. For 30 years, at least a dozen similar cases have been documented. Experienced hikers, sudden disorientation, GPS and compass failure, hours of missing time, and unexplained physical marks. The Forest Service had no official explanation. The area remained open, a silent trap in the wilderness. Isaac and Nora never hiked the North Cascades again. The experience had shattered their faith in the predictable order of the world. The circular burns faded slowly, leaving faint, white scars, permanent, chilling reminders of the hours that vanished and the questions that would never be answered. The aftermath, the scarred memory, the true horror of their experience was not the physical injury, but the void in their memory. The missing hours were a black hole in their consciousness, a terrifying awareness that a significant portion of their lives had been lived without their knowledge or consent. They would sit in their quiet Seattle apartment, trying to reconstruct the lost time, only to be met with a silent, echoing blankness. They consulted therapists, hypnotists, and even a few fringe researchers, desperate for a key to unlock the missing 2 hours. The hypnotists could only elicit fragmented, terrifying images, a blinding white light, a feeling of intense pressure, the smell of ozone and pine needles, and the sound of a high-pitched mechanical hum that vibrated in their bones. They learned that the geometric rock formation in the clearing was known locally, whispered about by the few rangers who had worked the area for decades. They called it the Stone Compass. It was a place where, according to local legend, the veil between worlds was thin and time itself could be manipulated or stolen. The radiation tests were never fully explained. The official report cited an unlikely exposure to naturally occurring radon gas. But the researcher who had contacted them, Dr. Alastair Finch, a retired geologist with an obsession for the unexplained, had a different theory. He believed the Stone Compass was a natural, or perhaps anciently constructed, focal point for a powerful, localized electromagnetic field. This field, he theorized, caused the compasses to spin and the GPS watches to glitch, and it was also responsible for the time slippage. The circular burns, he suggested, were a form of flash burn from an energy discharge that occurred during the temporal event. He showed them a grainy photograph, taken in 1988, of a man who had also gone missing and been found in the same area. The man had the same circular burns, and his medical report also noted elevated radiation. The man had been found wandering, deeply catatonic, and never recovered his memory of the missing time. Isaac and Nora became obsessed with the idea that they had been used. Used for what? They didn't know. But the fact that they were found 15 miles away, having traveled an impossible distance in an impossible time frame, suggested they were not just victims of a natural phenomenon. They were subjects. One night, 6 months after the incident, Nora woke up screaming. Isaac rushed to her side. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "I remember something," she choked out. "The humming. It was so loud. And the light, it wasn't white. It was green. And I wasn't standing. I was floating. And there were shapes. Tall, thin shapes standing around the Stone Compass. They weren't looking at us. They were looking at the rocks." She paused, shuddering violently. "And they were speaking, not in words, but the sound they made, it was the sound of my name. Isla. Not Nora. Isla. The sound from the recordings. The revelation was a final, shattering blow to their sanity. The voice Isla, the biologist, had heard was the same sound Nora had heard during her missing hours. The two separate, terrifying incidents were connected, linked by a shared, ancient, and non-human presence in the deep woods. Isaac and Nora sold their apartment and moved to the East Coast, to a city where the air was thick with the noise of humanity, where the sky was always visible, and where there were no mountains to hide the secrets of the ancient earth. They never spoke of the North Cascades again. But sometimes, when they are alone, they touch the faint, circular scars on their hands. And they wonder, were they truly released? Or are they just waiting for the day when the humming returns and the forest finally calls them home? The North Cascades holds its secrets close, and for Isaac and Nora, the silence of the mountains is the sound of a question mark hanging over the rest of their lives. Dylan took the fire lookout position for practical reasons, not romantic ones. At 24, armed with a freshly minted degree in environmental science and a resume that was failing to impress, the 6 weeks of paid isolation in Washington's Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest was a financial lifeline and a professional placeholder. He saw the tower as a quiet cubicle in the sky, a temporary perch from which to observe nature and plot his next career move. The training was straightforward. Learn the firefinder, master the radio protocols, maintain the solar panels, and endure the solitude. The ranger who trained him was matter-of-fact about the challenges, the psychological strain of isolation, the sudden, violent hostility of the weather, the soul-crushing monotony. But the ranger failed to mention the tower's true, terrifying secret. Dylan's first week was a study in routine. He established a rhythm that was almost monastic: 6 a.m. radio check-in, equipment maintenance, scans of the forest, reading, journaling. The tower stood in a clearing, deliberately maintained to provide a 360-degree view, a 100-yard circle of grass pressed close by the dense, ancient forest. During the day, the isolation was peaceful. He could see for miles, watching the shadows crawl across the distant ridges. But at night, the clearing transformed. The darkness beyond the reach of his floodlights was absolute, a heavy, velvet blackness that seemed to possess a physical weight. The forest sounds, the rustles, the snaps, the distant howls, took on a predatory edge. The tower, his supposed sanctuary, began to feel like a cage suspended over an abyss. It was on the 8th night of his rotation that he first noticed the figure. He had finished his sunset scan and was preparing for bed when he glanced out the north-facing window. Standing at the very edge of the clearing, precisely where the manicured grass surrendered to the wild, tangled tree line, was a human shape. It was too far, the light too dim, to make out any details. But it was undeniably person-shaped, standing with an unnerving, absolute stillness. It seemed to be looking directly at the tower. Dylan felt a jolt of surprise, quickly followed by a rush of adrenaline. A hiker, perhaps, who had camped nearby. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped onto the narrow platform surrounding the cabin. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing across the clearing, brittle and thin in the vast silence. There was no response. The figure remained motionless, a silhouette carved from the surrounding darkness. Dylan aimed his powerful flashlight beam toward the shape, but the light seemed to be swallowed, absorbed by the blackness before it could reach the figure. He could see the outline with his naked eye, but the beam failed to illuminate any detail, creating a disturbing, localized anomaly in the light. He called out again, asking if the person needed assistance. Still nothing. After several minutes of this one-sided interaction, Dylan retreated back inside, unsettled. He tried to rationalize it: a lost hiker, someone wearing headphones, someone who simply preferred not to interact. But the figure remained. For the next 3 hours, Dylan kept returning to the north window. The figure never moved, never shifted its posture. It was a statue of perfect, unnerving stillness, watching. When Dylan finally fell into an uneasy sleep, the figure was still there. When he woke the next morning, the clearing was empty. He considered reporting the incident, but dismissed it. What would he say? That a motionless person stood at the edge of the woods? It sounded like the first sign of cabin fever. But that night, the figure returned. Same location, same posture, same unnerving stillness. Dylan tried the flashlight again. The beam was still swallowed. He tried to take a photograph with his phone camera, but the resulting image was only darkness, even though the figure was clearly visible to his eye. He tried the high-power binoculars, but when he looked through the lenses, the figure seemed to blur, becoming indistinct, as if the optics were unable to resolve that specific point in space. Night after night, the pattern repeated. The figure would appear shortly after sunset, always in the same spot, and remain there for hours. Dylan, the scientist, began to time the appearances with meticulous care. It arrived at 8:47 p.m. and vanished precisely at 12:15 a.m. It was a clockwork terror, a scheduled haunting that mocked his sense of reality. He documented the phenomenon in his journal, the act of writing a desperate attempt to anchor himself to a reality that was clearly slipping away. On the 15th night, the pattern broke. The figure was closer, not at the tree line, but 10 yards into the clearing. Dylan's heart hammered against his ribs. He had been watching the clearing all evening, yet he had not seen it move. It had simply appeared closer, as if it had teleported from one location to another during the moments when he was not looking. The next night, it was closer still, then closer again. By the 20th night, the figure was standing roughly halfway between the tree line and the base of the tower. Dylan was no longer merely unsettled. He was genuinely, profoundly frightened. He called the Ranger District Office during his morning check-in, framing his report as a security concern. The ranger was sympathetic, but suggested it might be an animal, a standing deadwood snag, or a trick of the light in his own isolation. Dylan did not argue. He knew what he was seeing was neither animal nor tree. On the 23rd night, Dylan found footprints. He had forced himself to descend the tower stairs in the full light of day, his need for verification overriding his fear. Using his flashlight, he found clear boot prints in the soft earth around the tower foundation. The prints led from the direction of the tree line directly to the tower, circled the structure twice, and then led back toward the clearing. But the prints did not reach the tree line. They simply ended in the middle of the clearing, as if the person making them had vanished into thin air or had been picked up and carried away. Dylan scrambled back up to the cabin, his hands shaking as he locked the thin door. The tower, designed to protect him from nature, was utterly vulnerable to a human or a thing that could simply appear and disappear at will. The windows did not lock. The walls were thin. He was a piece of meat in a glass jar. That night, the figure was closer than ever, a dark, silent sentinel just yards from the base of the tower. Dylan sat frozen in the center of the cabin, staring at the floor. Then he heard it. Footsteps on the tower stairs. The metallic clang of boots on steel steps, slow, deliberate, unhurried, ascending the 72 steps from the ground to the cabin platform. Clang, clang, clang. Each step was a hammer blow against Dylan's sanity. He sat rigid, his phone in his hand, unable to call for help. What would he say? There are footsteps on my stairs, but I don't know who or what is making them. The footsteps continued, methodical and relentless. They reached the top landing, and they stopped. Silence. Dylan stared at the thin wooden door, every muscle tense, waiting for a crash, a scream, a burst of violence. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then he heard scratching, a slow, deliberate sound like fingernails or claws being dragged across the wooden door frame, just inches from his head. Screech, screech. The sound was wet, grating, and utterly inhuman. It continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, methodical violation of his sanctuary. Then it stopped. The footsteps began again, this time descending, fading slowly into the darkness below. Dylan did not sleep. He sat in the center of the floor until the first pale light of dawn touched the clearing. He immediately radioed the district office, requesting emergency extraction. He broke protocol, detailing the incident, his voice ragged with exhaustion and fear. He stated, unequivocally, that he would not spend another night in the tower. The ranger who responded sounded concerned, not about the supernatural, but about Dylan's mental state. They arranged for a replacement and told Dylan to wait. While he waited, he forced himself to examine the door. The wood showed fresh gouges, deep parallel marks that could not have been caused by any animal native to the area. They were too high, too deliberate, too organized. When the replacement lookout arrived, Dylan gave a brief, clinical handover, omitting all mention of the figure, the footsteps, and the scratching. He simply gathered his belongings and hiked down the trail, desperate to put distance between himself and that terrible, silent tower. Later, through sympathetic contact, Dylan learned the truth. He was the third lookout in 5 years to request early termination from that specific tower. His contact mentioned quietly that the tower was now being equipped with remote cameras and sensors, so it could be monitored without a human occupant. The official reason was budget efficiency, but Dylan knew the real reason. No one wanted to address the fact that something was watching that tower. Something that appeared like clockwork, grew closer each night, left footprints that ended in empty air, and scratched at the door with claws that left marks too deep to ignore. Dylan was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress and anxiety disorder. He left the forestry field entirely. He lives now in a brightly lit city apartment, surrounded by the noise of traffic and the comforting presence of millions of other people. But sometimes, when the streetlights flicker or the elevator hums, he remembers the absolute silence of that clearing. And he knows, with a cold certainty that will never leave him, that the figure is still there, standing at the edge of the woods, waiting for the next person to climb the stairs. And he wonders if the new remote cameras ever capture a glimpse of the dark, motionless shape that watches the tower, eternally waiting for the clockwork terror to begin again. Camila had built her true crime podcast, The Cold Vault, on the bedrock of meticulous research. She sought out the cases the public had forgotten, the unsolved disappearances that defied logic. Her latest obsession had drawn her to the Oregon forest south of Portland, to a small, mountainous area where a sinister pattern of vanishing hikers had been repeating for 15 years. 8 experienced hikers, all alone, all disappeared during daylight hours. No bodies, no backpacks, no trace. The local sheriff's department treated them as individual missing persons cases, but Camila saw the terrifying, undeniable pattern. Her preliminary research had chilled her to the bone. The disappearances occurred in a remarkably consistent time frame, September or October, following a precise 3-year cycle. The last one had been 3 years ago. This year, the cycle was due to repeat. Camila was aware of the risk, but she was a professional, armed with satellite communication equipment, detailed trip reports filed with her producer, and a steely resolve. She planned a 2-day expedition to the area, intending to document the terrain, record ambient audio, and try to understand what made this small patch of forest a magnet for the lost. Her first day was uneventful, a deceptive calm. The forest was beautiful, but aggressively so. Massive Douglas firs blocked the sunlight, creating a perpetual, claustrophobic twilight. The undergrowth was a dense, tangled mess of ferns and salal. She could easily see how a novice might get lost, but not 8 seasoned hikers. The explanation felt thin, insufficient for the scale of the mystery. On her second day, she deviated from the established trails. An interview with a missing hiker's family member had mentioned an old, unmapped logging road, a local secret. After an hour of searching, Camila found it, an overgrown, barely visible path, marked only by subtle indentations in the forest floor. She followed it for 20 minutes, moving slowly and carefully. Her GPS confirmed she was still within the general area of the disappearances. The trail led her to a feature she hadn't seen on any of her topographical maps, a deep, steep-sided ravine with a small, dark creek running through the bottom. The descent was treacherous, forcing her to use trees and exposed roots as handholds. She decided to limit her search to 30 minutes. What she found at the bottom changed everything. Scattered among the rocks and damp leaves were personal items: a faded water bottle with a Seattle sports team logo, a relatively new hiking boot half buried in the debris, a torn piece of fabric. Then, the most disturbing find: a water-damaged wallet containing the identification and credit cards of one of the missing hikers. Camila documented everything with her camera, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was careful not to disturb the evidence, marking the GPS coordinates. It was proof. The missing hikers hadn't just wandered off. They had met a fate here in this forgotten ravine. As she worked, she noticed something else. Structures. Small, perhaps 2 feet tall, built from carefully arranged bones and branches, interwoven in patterns that were deliberate, not random. She counted 6 of these markers positioned along the ravine floor. They were primitive, ritualistic, reminding her of the markers serial killers sometimes leave, but these felt older, more ancient, a tradition that predated modern criminal psychology. They made her profoundly, physically uncomfortable. She was examining the 3rd structure when she heard movement in the forest above her. Not the random rustle of an animal, but the deliberate, heavy sound of a person moving through the undergrowth, branches snapping, footsteps pausing, then continuing. Camila called out, identifying herself as a researcher. No response. The movement continued, and she realized with growing alarm that whoever was up there was circling the ravine, changing position, watching her from multiple vantage points along the rim. She made a decision to leave. Now, she scrambled back up the steep side of the ravine, her mind racing, abandoning all thought of proper documentation. When she reached the top, she saw a figure 50 yards away, partially concealed behind a massive tree. The figure was wearing dark, drab outdoor clothing that blended perfectly with the forest, but the way they stood, still partially hidden, watching, made her certain this was not a casual hiker. Camila turned and walked quickly back toward the overgrown trail, fighting the urge to run, knowing that running would signal fear. Behind her, she heard the figure following, making no attempt to close the distance, but maintaining a consistent, unnerving interval of 40 or 50 yards. She pulled out her satellite communicator and activated the emergency beacon. This would alert the authorities to her location and that she was in distress. She continued walking, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. After 10 minutes of this terrifying escort, the sounds of pursuit stopped. She looked back. No one. She walked for another hour until she intersected with an established trail and encountered a pair of day hikers. 3 hours later, the emergency beacon brought Forest Service rangers and sheriff's deputies to her location. Camila led them back to the ravine. It took longer to find than she expected. The landmarks seemed to have shifted in the afternoon light. When they finally located the ravine and descended to the floor, they found nothing. No personal items. No water bottle. No boot. No wallet. The forest floor was undisturbed, showing no evidence that anyone had been there recently. The deputies were professional, but clearly skeptical. Camila showed them the photographs on her camera. But when she reviewed the images, a cold wave of dread washed over her. Most of them had failed to record properly. The photos of the personal items showed only the forest floor with no visible objects. The images of the bone structures were completely black, as if taken in darkness, despite the fact that she had recorded them in broad daylight. Only her GPS coordinates remained, proving she had been in the location she claimed, but providing no evidence of what she had found there. One of the deputies mentioned, almost casually, that this wasn't the first time someone had reported finding evidence in this area that subsequently vanished. He didn't elaborate, but the implication was clear. This place actively erased its own secrets. The deputies confirmed they had found tracks belonging to 2 different people. Camila's and someone else's. But the other tracks ended abruptly in the middle of the forest, with no explanation for how the person making them had departed. The wallet, the critical piece of evidence, was never recovered. The bone structures were unexplained. Camila returned home, shaken and confused. She never released the podcast episode. She couldn't reconcile her documented research with the impossibility of what had happened. The 3-year cycle in the year following her experience, the 3-year cycle completed its rotation. Another hiker disappeared from the same general area. A man in his 30s, hiking alone, last seen within 2 miles of the ravine. His disappearance matched the pattern perfectly. The case remains unsolved. Camila shifted her podcast focus entirely, concentrating on solved crimes, clear documentation, and verifiable facts. But she knows what she found in that ravine. She knows that someone or something had been watching her. She knows that the evidence she documented vanished without explanation. She has concluded that some stories are not meant to be told because the telling itself might draw unwanted attention, or because the truth is something that cannot be captured by recording equipment or verified by physical evidence. The forest south of Portland continues to draw hikers, unaware of the pattern, and the area remains officially open despite the unresolved cases. The deepening horror Camila's research had pointed to a human predator, a serial killer using the forest as a hunting ground. But the vanishing evidence, the bone structures, and the figure that moved with unnatural stealth suggested something far more ancient and terrifying. She began to research local indigenous folklore, something she had previously dismissed as background. She found references to a creature known as the Hushwalker, a being that haunted the deep woods, known not for violence, but for its ability to steal things, sound, time, and memory. The Hushwalker was said to be a guardian of forbidden places, and its presence was marked by an unnatural silence and the erasure of all evidence of its passing. The bone structures she saw in the ravine suddenly made sense. They were not monuments to murder. They were offerings left by the Hushwalker or those who served it, a primitive form of payment to the entity that kept the place sacred and secret. The figure she saw watching her was not the Hushwalker itself, but perhaps a servant of the forest, a human who had succumbed to its influence, or a previous victim who had been transformed into a sentinel. The tracks that ended abruptly in the middle of the forest were the tracks of a being that did not need to walk the entire distance back to the tree line. The most terrifying thought was the 3-year cycle. It wasn't a serial killer's pattern. It was a harvest schedule. The disappearances were a ritual, a periodic offering to the entity that guarded the ravine, a payment for the forest's continued silence. And Camila had walked right into the middle of the ritual site, documented the offerings, and then had her evidence systematically erased. She now lives with the chilling certainty that she was not just a researcher, she was a target. She was allowed to leave, not because she was safe, but because the Hushwalker had chosen to spare her, perhaps to send a message, or perhaps to keep her as a witness to its terrifying power. She still keeps the GPS coordinates of the ravine, a single, verifiable data point in a sea of impossible events. She looks at the coordinates, sometimes a string of numbers that marks the place where the world broke. She knows that in a few years, the cycle will complete again. And she knows that the forest south of Portland is not just a place where people get lost. It is a place where the forest itself chooses who is allowed to leave and who is destined to become part of its silent, ancient secret. Anthony was a man whose life was measured in board feet and quarterly quotas. For 12 years, he had navigated the labyrinthine world of the logging industry, rising to crew supervisor through sheer competence and a pragmatic respect for the forest. His current operation, a selective harvest in the Oregon Coast Range, was a tightrope walk, balance environmental compliance with a relentless pressure to meet production targets. In early November, his team moved into a new section, The marking crew had painted the orange bands, designating the trees approved for cutting. Anthony's job was the final verification, the planning, the orchestration of the heavy machinery that would turn ancient wood into profit. On the third day, the rhythm of work was broken. A young crew member, a man named Jesse whose family had logged this region for generations, called Anthony over to a colossal Douglas fir. It was a giant, a true old-growth sentinel, easily 8 feet in diameter, soaring over 200 feet. It was a tree that represented a small fortune in premium lumber, and it bore the bright orange band of death. But Jesse wasn't looking at the band. He was pointing 6 feet up the trunk to a series of symbols carved into the bark. They were geometric, abstract patterns, clearly deliberate, but weathered by decades of exposure. "Boss," Jesse said, his voice low and tight, "my grandfather told me about trees like this. They're marked. You don't cut them." Anthony examined the carvings. They were unlike any graffiti he had ever seen. They looked less like vandalism and more like a forgotten language. He knew the local lore. Trees marked with certain symbols were considered sacred, cultural markers of the indigenous people who had lived here for millennia. He documented the symbols with his phone camera, the flash illuminating the deep, ancient cuts in the bark. He felt a profound sense of unease, a cold certainty that cutting this tree would be a violation. He called his district manager, a man named Henderson, and explained the situation. Henderson's response was a masterclass in corporate pragmatism. "Anthony, we have all the permits. We've done the cultural surveys. That tree is on private land, and it represents $10,000 in immediate value. Folklore is not a legal injunction. Find me the code violation, or cut the tree." Anthony felt the familiar, sickening pressure. His crew needed the work. The company needed the profit. He spent the next day trying to find a loophole, sending the photographs to 2 local tribal offices, leaving detailed messages. No one called back. The silence was deafening, a refusal to engage with the modern world's demands. After 3 days, the order came from corporate: proceed with the harvest. The night before the scheduled felling, the forest began to fight back. Every member of Anthony's crew, scattered in their homes miles from the work site, experienced the same shared nightmare. They compared notes later, their faces etched with a fear that transcended superstition. The dreams were a collage of terror, suffocating darkness, the feeling of being trapped in an endless, thorny maze, and a hostile, unseen presence that watched them with a cold, ancient malice. The common thread was a sound, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in their bones, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The next morning, 3 crew members called in sick. 2 others simply vanished, their phones going straight to voicemail. The remaining crew was nervous, distracted, their eyes constantly darting toward the massive, silent fir. The operation was a disaster from the first cut. The chainsaw operator, a seasoned veteran named Rick, reported that his saw kept stalling. "It's like the chain is hitting concrete, boss," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. A backup saw did the same. The electronic ignition systems failed repeatedly. Hydraulic lines on the excavator developed impossible leaks. A winch cable, rated for 20 tons, snapped under a fraction of its capacity, nearly taking out 2 workers. By early afternoon, Anthony was defeated. He called a halt, ordering a full mechanical inspection. He knew the problem wasn't the equipment. It was the tree. That night, the terror escalated. Another crew member quit, leaving a cryptic note about the eyes in the dark. Ella, the company medic, reported a surge in complaints, persistent debilitating headaches, acute nausea, and a pervasive sense of dread. She noted that the symptoms only appeared when the men were near the marked tree. Despite the mounting evidence of a supernatural resistance, the company insisted. The next morning, Anthony, feeling the cold weight of his professional obligation, ordered the final cut. The felling was a slow-motion nightmare. No one could stay near the tree for more than 30 minutes without being overcome by dizziness and nausea. They worked in shifts, their movements sluggish, their faces pale. The low, subsonic hum from the nightmares seemed to permeate the air, a pressure that squeezed their minds. When the tree finally fell, the sound was not the expected crash. It was a high-pitched, tearing scream, a sound that several crew members later swore was utterly human, a sound of agony and finality. The massive trunk hit the earth with a sickening thud. The crew rushed to inspect the damage. The tree had been partially hollow, which was not uncommon. But what they found inside the hollow section was a horror that transcended all their fear of the supernatural. Human remains. Old, incomplete, wrapped in decayed leather and textile. Alongside the remains were carved bone implements and shell beads, indigenous ritual items. The tree had been a crypt, a sacred burial site that predated the company, the state, and the nation. The symbols were not just markers. They were a ward, a warning to leave the dead in peace. Work stopped immediately. Law enforcement, state cultural resource officials, and eventually tribal elders arrived. The remains were centuries old, a sacred burial desecrated for $10,000 of wood. The psychological fallout was immediate. 5 crew members left the company within a week. Anthony himself began to suffer. The fever, the constant sense of dread, and the hallucinations intensified. He would see figures in traditional dress at the edge of his vision, silent, accusatory, vanishing when he turned to look. The symbols from the tree appeared in his dreams, glowing orange, pulsing with malevolent energy. Other crew members reported similar experiences. Voices in the forest at night, speaking a language they didn't understand, the low, bone-vibrating hum returning in the quiet of their homes. One man, convinced the spirits were following him, suffered an acute psychotic episode and was hospitalized. Finally, representatives from the local tribal nations performed a ceremony at the site. The remains were reinterred with traditional rites. The ceremony helped, but the psychological scars remained. The logging company, facing massive legal and public relations fallout, relocated its operations and designated the section where the tree had stood as a permanent cultural resource protection zone. Anthony transferred to a different company in a different state, unable to work in forests where he constantly feared repeating his mistake. Years later, he still experiences the nightmares. He still sees the figures in his peripheral vision, and the tree stump, the massive, dead sentinel, continues its silent protest. It weeps dark, viscous sap whenever it rains, a phenomenon that defies all botanical explanation. The area around the stump is utterly silent, avoided by all wildlife, a natural warning that the forest has marked this spot as forbidden. Anthony knows he was not just a supervisor. He was the instrument of a profound violation. He cut the tree despite the warnings. And now, the forest has cut him off from peace. He lives with the chilling certainty that the spirits he disturbed are not gone. They are simply waiting. And the weeping stump is a constant, dark reminder of the price of desecration. Luke was an acoustic ecologist, a man whose life was dedicated to listening to the hidden language of the world. He specialized in bioacoustics, but his true passion was the fringe, the sounds that defied easy classification. His current project had brought him to the remote, high-altitude forests near Mount Hood, an area known for its profound, yet strangely unsettling silence. He was searching for a sound that had been reported anecdotally by hikers for years, a low, resonant thrumming, often mistaken for distant machinery or a geological rumble, but which seemed to induce feelings of intense dread and physical sickness. Luke, armed with professional-grade recording equipment capable of capturing frequencies far below the range of human hearing, was determined to capture the infrasound of dread. He found on his third day. He was deep in a ravine, setting up a parabolic microphone array. When the feeling began, it wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but a pressure he felt in his chest, a deep, bone-vibrating thrum that seemed to bypass his auditory system entirely. It brought with it a sudden, acute wave of nausea, a dizzying vertigo, and a persistent, disproportionate anxiety. He checked his equipment. The meters were spiking. The sound was there, a powerful presence in the 15 to 35 hertz range, infrasound. This was the frequency range that humans perceive as vibration, known to cause physical discomfort, disorientation, and even hallucinations in sensitive individuals. Luke, despite the overwhelming physical discomfort, remained a scientist. He documented his physical state: nausea, mild vertigo, a persistent feeling of anxiety. He packed his gear quickly and hiked back to his studio, eager to analyze the recording properly. That evening, working in his home studio with professional audio analysis software, Luke examined the waveform in detail. What he found was genuinely puzzling. The sound was too regular to be wind or geological activity, yet too complex to be machinery or human-made equipment. The waveform suggested some kind of interference between multiple sources, as if several different generators were operating simultaneously, creating a complex, shifting pattern of energy. He shared the recording with colleagues in the audio engineering community. Their analysis confirmed his observations and added more questions. One colleague noted that the fundamental frequency shifted slightly during the recording, suggesting a moving source. But the Doppler effect was all wrong for any known moving object. Another identified harmonic overtones that should not exist if the sound was being produced by mechanical means. The recording, which Luke had tentatively named the Hood Hum, began circulating online through audio forums and paranormal investigation groups. Hundreds of people downloaded it and listened. That's when the true horror began. Multiple listeners reported severe adverse reactions, headaches that persisted for hours, vivid nightmares featuring themes of being lost in forests or pursued by unseen presences. In 3 documented cases, people experienced panic attacks while listening to the audio, something that seemed extreme given that the sound itself was not loud or jarring. One listener claimed to have suffered a seizure. Luke was alarmed. He made the decision to remove the recording from public distribution, but it was too late. It had been downloaded and shared widely enough that copies continued to circulate beyond his control, a self-replicating vector of dread. The phenomenon attracted the attention of researchers from Oregon State University. A formal investigation was organized. A team of acoustic specialists, geologists, and psychologists traveling to the Mount Hood area with sophisticated equipment. They established a base camp and spent 5 days conducting measurements. On the third day, they recorded the sound. Their data largely confirmed Luke's findings. But the mystery deepened. Seismic monitoring showed no unusual ground vibrations. Atmospheric measurements were normal. Systematic testing ruled out electronic interference. The research team was left with high-quality recordings of a phenomenon they could not explain. Analysis of their data revealed that the sound appeared to originate from multiple points simultaneously, distributed throughout the forest, rather than emanating from a single location. Triangulation attempts produced impossible results, suggesting the sound was either being reflected in ways that defied normal acoustic behavior or was somehow being generated from within the forest canopy and the ground simultaneously. More concerning was the finding from the psychological assessment component of the study. Team members who were exposed to the sound directly in the field showed measurable changes in brain activity patterns, particularly in regions associated with fear response and spatial orientation. These changes persisted for hours after exposure and were, in some cases, accompanied by reports of mild hallucinations or intrusive thoughts. The investigation was quietly suspended after the lead researcher was hospitalized following a severe migraine episode. The researcher privately confided to colleagues that the symptoms were far more disturbing. Hallucinations of figures moving through the forest, a persistent sensation of being watched, and auditory hallucinations of voices speaking in unknown languages. The university research team's findings were documented in internal reports but never published. The data was too inconsistent for peer review, and the Institutional Review Board raised ethical concerns about exposing subjects to a phenomenon that had clear psychological and physiological effects. The sound continues to be reported periodically by hikers in the Mount Hood area. Forest Service rangers are aware of the phenomenon, but there is no official explanation or warning system. The area remains open to public access, a silent trap waiting for the next listener. Luke deleted all copies of the recording from his personal archives. He refused multiple requests to recreate or redistribute the audio. He suffered from recurring nightmares for months after his initial encounter with the sound. Dreams that always featured the forest and always included a presence he could sense but never fully see. Attempts to locate and identify the source of the sound have failed repeatedly. The sound appears and disappears according to no predictable schedule. And when it does occur, it defies the normal rules of acoustic propagation, seeming to exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Indigenous groups from the region, when asked, have generally declined to comment publicly. However, one tribal elder mentioned privately that certain areas of the forest have always been considered spiritually active, and that sounds without apparent sources have been part of oral tradition for generations. The elder suggested that some boundaries exist for reasons that Western science is not equipped to understand, and that perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and rather respected. Luke now lives with the chilling certainty that he did not record a natural phenomenon, but a sentient one. The sound was not a byproduct of some geological or mechanical process. It was a form of communication, a low, resonant, territorial warning. The fact that it caused feelings of dread and triggered the fear response in the human brain was not a side effect. It was the purpose. He believes the sound is the voice of the forest itself, or perhaps an ancient entity that resides within it, using infrasound to mark its territory and drive intruders away. The fact that the sounds seem to originate from multiple points simultaneously suggests that the entity is not a single, localized creature, but a pervasive, distributed intelligence, a consciousness woven into the very fabric of the trees and the earth. Luke refuses to discuss his experience in detail, beyond acknowledging that it happened and that he regrets having shared the recording publicly. The forest around Mount Hood maintains its secrets, and somewhere in those ancient stands of Douglas fir and mountain hemlock, a sound continues to pulse through the air and ground, waiting for the next person who will feel the deep, resonant thrum in their chest and wonder what it means, and why it creates such profound, soul-deep unease in everyone who experiences it. The infrasound of dread is the silent, constant heartbeat of a hostile, ancient world.